What a beautiful image of voices coming together, creating home. So on that theme, when I say the word home, I wonder what might come to mind for you. Is it a specific place, maybe where you live now, or maybe it's where you grew up? Maybe it's a building or a city or a country. Maybe home is a person. Maybe home is this very church building, which we celebrated so well last week on its 100th birthday. Maybe home is grounding for you to think of, or maybe it evokes some longing or loss or something else complex. We know in these times that home is political. Who is considered to be at home here and who is not? Who is allowed to feel at home and relaxed, walk and drive and work confidently, and who cannot? I find this idea for myself of home to be very evocative, and the notion of homecoming adds yet another dimension. For me, at least, homecoming seems to be in the future, something that is still coming, something that is still for us to await. It could be said that in a way, the whole Bible is understood as a yearning for homecoming, this promise that is held out ahead of us on the horizon. We start off in the beginning of the Bible with the creation of our common home here, the earth, and we get, unfortunately, just a blissful few moments there before we are exiled from the Garden of Eden into a life of labor and struggle, seasons of wandering in the desert, exiled from that Eden. As we go further in the story, we hear of kingdoms built that arise and then fall. Time and again, people lose their way from home and then find it a bit again. Once we get to the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, we hear of Jesus, who was not born in a home at all, but in a makeshift dwelling designed not for humans, but animals. Jesus is born to parents who are far from home, and they are on a journey that is not of their choosing. And after Jesus' birth, his parents, his family need to leave again, this time for Egypt, to escape those who would do him harm. Jesus' whole ministry is a traveling one. He's always going somewhere to teach or to heal or turn over tables. He visits many homes for sure, but he doesn't really seem to have one for himself, at least not one that we hear of. Then we get the stories of the disciples and the apostles that come after Jesus, and they're told that to follow Jesus means to not be at home in this world, fully at least. They are told time and again to go out, to share good news, to cross boundaries, to experience different cultures. Sometimes they find hospitality and sometimes they find hostility. But it seems that the followers of Jesus are not to get too comfortable, but they are instead to be people of the way, people on the move. And then finally, at the very end of the Bible, we're doing this very quickly, this overview. At the very end, we hear of a new Jerusalem. We are promised this sparkling city, this brand new home, but not quite in our lifetime, most likely. It is very much a vision of homecoming, a home that is still to come. A place that we get to envision, but it's not yet built. We aren't going back to Eden, but there is a home waiting for us ahead, maybe even faintly visible on a clear day. So all throughout the Bible, broadly speaking, as I said, we hear of more specific also longings for homecoming, to return and to go back somewhere that was more known. For example, we remember the Israelites, even after they're freed from slavery in Egypt, where they were really sorely oppressed. But in the 40 years they spent wandering the desert, things are just so rough that they even long to go back to their bondage in Egypt, just to have some measure of stability or a home base. It's somewhat relatable. Maybe even if though few of us come from perfect homes, we know that some in our world have experienced even more difficult homes that are truly unsafe and unloving. And even when we get away from those, we know many people go back, even to those broken places. Home is really complicated and its pull can be strong. So, to tell you a story, my nuclear family went on a bit of a homecoming trip a few years ago. We went to Iceland, which is where my dad's family emigrated to Canada, which is where I grew up, from in the 1870s. It was really wonderful for us to meet some distant relatives and see this beautiful country. If you've never been, it's really lovely. There's waterfalls, there's fjords, there's geothermal hot springs everywhere. Highly recommend it. And these relatives that we'd only recently got in contact with were delightfully welcoming. My family actually connected with these folks because of those ancestry tests, if you can believe it. And my parents had first encountered these relatives in person after they got connected through the ancestry tests, when actually the Icelandic relatives had been to Canada the year before our trip. And they had gone there to attend the annual Icelandic festival that takes place near where I grew up. It turns out that's actually kind of common for Icelanders to come all the way to Canada to go to this festival and see what Iceland was like in the 1800s, which is kind of better preserved at this festival than anywhere actually in Iceland itself. Kind of funny, right? So then, the following year, when we took this trip to Iceland, we visited my relative's modern Reykjavik condo, and my distant aunt, by some relation, made us this dessert called vinaterta one night. Now, vinaterta, if you're not familiar, it's a multi-leveled dessert. It looks quite pretty. It looks like a cake, but it's really quite dry, and I would say personally not that sweet or that tasty. Now, if you're a child, as I was growing up, and you saw it and you always expected cake and you got really excited, you will learn to kind of associate this with a slightly disappointing experience. It always came out on special occasions like weddings or big birthday parties for my grandparents, and I would get deceived by it every time, seeing those layers and forgetting that the layers were actually filled with a prune or a date filling, and no frosting at all. But yet we ate this dessert quite often to preserve the tradition, this family connection to Iceland. So then on this trip, my parents were like, oh, we should have vinaterta. So we went to all these bakeries, and we looked for it everywhere we went across the country, but we never once saw one for sale. So my distant aunt in her condo very graciously found the recipe for it actually online and made it for us for her very first time. And I thought that was kind of telling. The reality is that places do not stay the same as you leave them. Icelanders have learned to make other desserts, not just vinaterta. But home is always changing, with or without you there. And I think we all know that in a way. Who hasn't gone back to visit a place where you used to live, or maybe where you used to go to school, your old class, and been a bit thrown off by the change that has taken place? Even if it hasn't been that long, it's always different to be a visitor somewhere than to live somewhere. I remember the first time that I went back to Toronto, which is the city that I lived from ages 18 to 29, for my very first visit after moving here to the Bay Area. And I was so excited to go back and visit my friends and see some old colleagues at the place where I used to work. I really loved that job, and it was a really special place. But even when I went there, after some quick catch-ups, my former colleagues all drifted back to the pressing work on their desks, work that I was no longer part of. It really, to me, spoke about how going back isn't exactly possible. Even on that trip, as I wandered the city, I found that many of my favorite places, my coffee shops, my favorite restaurants had closed, and the city looked quite different, but I always couldn't quite pinpoint why. I knew that there was something else on that corner, but just what was it? Also, kind of surprisingly, one of my favorite things I did during that trip was to have dinner with an acquaintance who I hadn't really known that well when I actually lived in the city. Overall, it was a fine trip, but I think it really drove home to me that there's no going back in time. My former home, as all of our former homes, they move on without us. And of course, for me, that was a pretty simple case. How much more complex is this sense of change in homes when people are forced to leave, or when laws or finances do not allow for visits back, or at least not for many, many years? Or how about cases when there are no buildings left standing back home, or beloved people are no longer there to visit? This reality of how places change came up also a fair bit when I was part of a multi-faith LGBT group at my university in undergrad. We talked a lot about whose families were supportive and whose were struggling. And I remember a lot of times what people would share was that their parents would say things like, "Oh no, there are no gay people in Korea. There are no trans people in Bulgaria. All women in the Philippines wear skirts." That's what these students' parents would say. And often these students' parents had immigrated many decades ago, and they had this frozen in time picture of their homeland. But then some of my classmates, some of the students in the group, would share that it was kind of interesting that actually when they went to visit these home countries where their parents or grandparents had come from, they often had a very different experience, finding gay bars, for instance, or even pants to have proliferated in the decades since their parents left. And sometimes they would find even cousins or other relatives to have more accepting views. It seemed that their parents could not or would not see this change, that they were so invested in the image of a stagnant, or perhaps better put, stable image of their home. And, to be compassionate, I'm sure that this was in part due to the trauma of this immigration experience. I have a lot of compassion for why folks might lean on an unchanging image of home, even if that image serves to marginalize or hurt folks, while at the same time providing others centering. This week, after the killing of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk, we are reminded yet again of the need for safe and affirming spaces of home for all. And we know that hostility is not something that's limited to other countries. It's very much alive here as well. We know that the need for a sense of home and respectful conversation across difference is truer now than ever, perhaps. Many people have found the Bible passage that we read today to be really comforting, given especially the perils of migration and the broader challenges we all face in life. This passage promises us a home and assures us that even if we struggle in this life and in this political season of our nation, that even if our homes or our homelands are destroyed, or even if we maybe never had a home to begin with, that there is a home for us with God. I also, in some ways, appreciate that the passage suggests that two things can be simultaneously true. That on a material level, we can be exiled or even destroyed, but at the same time, on a spiritual level, things can be all right. Even if the things we see fail us, there is a reality beyond, ahead on the horizon, that is eternal. From a social justice perspective, we know that this idea of homecoming is complex and relevant for so many today, especially perhaps migrants and refugees, those who are intergenerationally and internationally displaced, like so many Palestinians, rural, queer, and trans people, even within the US, who are exiled from their families and communities into cities. We know even about how low-income Black and brown people here in the Bay Area are pushed further and further from the city to outer suburbs and further afield due to affordability. While in many cases folks create home in the new places where they live, I also want to name that homecoming is never simply a spiritual exercise and that specific places don't still matter. The scholars who write about this Bible passage we read say that it is about this idea of reconciliation, which I think is interesting. This was an important theme for the Jewish tradition, important for Paul, who this letter that we read from Scripture is attributed to. And for me, at least, I generally think of reconciliation as just an interpersonal thing. But drawing on that Jewish tradition for the early church, reconciliation was much broader and meant all things being made right. All harms rectified, all losses canceled out, all places and people restored. A complete coming home to God, so to speak. Now, one of the challenges with this passage is it can seem to support the idea of a bit of a body and soul or body and spirit dualism. It can suggest that our earthly homes and our physical bodies don't really matter because, they can be destroyed and everything can still be okay. But I found it helpful to learn that is more of a Platonistic view, That for the actual ancient Jewish context that Paul would have been deeply familiar with, reconciliation was instead understood, as I said, to be about all things, all people, all parts of ourselves, all parts of the world, everything in the universe being made right. So to say that our earthly tent may be destroyed is not saying that it may not matter. It is saying, I think, instead, that it's not beyond God's ability to reconcile and make right, even what seems destroyed beyond repair. We can still come home, even if it seems like there is no place left to come home to. I was also kind of intrigued about the part of the text that talks about not wanting to become unclothed. It's kind of a strange metaphor. And no, it's not about showing skin or not showing skin. That actually, for Paul, becoming unclothed, it would have been understood as a metaphor for dying. So as our human skin wrinkles and sags, and yes, does eventually come off our bones in death, it is like we are losing our outward identity. So when Paul says we wish not to become unclothed, but further clothed, he is saying, wouldn't it be great to be united with God, to come home to the Creator without any suffering or dying or any of that stuff at all? Wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to go through the trials of life, of aging, of loss, of destruction or death? What if we could just go straight home, or maybe never have to leave home to begin with? But that's not how things work. Paul says that even if we lose this earthly bodily skin clothing, we will not be found naked, because we are promised that that is not all that there is. Even as we may lose our abilities, lose our sight, we can still, yes, walk by faith. Wherever we are on our earthly journey, be that the beginning, middle, or the end, we can be comforted by the bigger picture, that we can love God and serve neighbor wherever we may be. I think this passage is helpful when we think of our call to work for justice. For me, I find it a reminder that even when all things might seem lost, they are not. Even when things may be at their worst, there is a reality beyond that. Even if our work seems like a failure, if our world seems irreconcilably broken, even if we feel like failures, God judges by different standards. Reconciliation is still possible. We are also promised that even if we do not feel at home in this world, we do have a home with God. Whether we are strong or weak, confident or afraid, at home or away or somewhere in between, we can always serve, we can always love. I'm not sure how today, as Homecoming Sunday, feels for you. For me personally, I'm feeling quite back at home after many of you will know I was traveling a lot this summer. But at the same time, I'm always a bit wistful that summer, which is my favorite time of year, is drawing to an end. Maybe you too have some joy and some sadness mixed together. If you, like me, are looking at our world, you might also feel just decentered and feel very much not at home in much of what's going on. But at the same time, also be celebrating the beauty of the natural world at this time of year when so much is coming to fruit, so much is coming to bloom. So both things can be both true at once. For you personally, maybe there are bittersweet parts of even church homecoming. Maybe looking around, remembering faces that are now missing from the pews, even as you also rejoice in new faces too. We know that homecoming is never fully complete on this side of the veil. But yet, we can still find home even in this moment with all these complexities. No matter how much has been lost, no matter how at home or not you feel in your body, in your life, in this moment in time. No matter if this church feels very much at home to you or if it is your very first time here. One of the gifts, I believe, of spiritual practice is finding at least a kernel of home wherever we are, despite all of the changes around us. One of the gifts is the opportunity to love people like family, even if they are strangers, to love ourselves, even when our own bodies feel strange to us. The gift of taking good care, even if you'll never be back again. The gift of loving deeply, even though you know it may not last. I think that homecoming, like most holidays, is most challenging when we always expect things to be the very same. I think many of us know that from, Christmas or other celebrations. When we expect it to be the exact same every year, we're probably disappointed. If we expect traditions never to change, or if we expect our bodies to always be able to do the exact same things, that's not the sort of home we get here on this earth. We don't get to go back in time, but we are promised a reconciliation of what matters most, and this remains ahead of us on the horizon, still to come. And we don't want to miss out on the beauty of what is, blinded by memories of what was, or distracted by imaginations of what could be. When I think back to that trip to Toronto that I told you about, while it was disorienting in some ways, it was also fun. I had a chance to visit museums that I had never had an opportunity to do because I was too busy when I lived there. And that dinner that I mentioned with that acquaintance that I didn't know well, but who had just responded to my social media post that I said I would be in town, it was actually quite lovely, and I might never have spent time with them if it was not for that visit. Visiting is never the same as living somewhere, but it can be good in its own way. In this life, we never get to go back in time, but we can try not to let us miss out on the gifts of this moment. Maybe somewhere in God's time there is a rewind button, but here in Earth's time, play and maybe fast forward are the only settings we get. It's a spiritual discipline, and I know one that I struggle with, to try to stay on play and not move too quickly ahead. In the meantime, in this life, before that great reconciliation of all things, the best we can get, I think, are glimpses of that ultimate homecoming. And we can lean into that paradox of both being at home and not at home, both here and away. At God's table, we are both guest and host, served and serving. If we come hungry, we will be fed, and if we come fed, we must hunger for all to have the same. If we come walking by faith, we will be gifted with insight and foresight. If we are falling apart, we are promised reconciliation and repair. Church is a home on earth, yes, but its primary purpose is to point us toward our ultimate home, that is still awaiting for us ahead on the horizon. All are welcome here in this church home. There is no price of entry, no down payment required, no rent coming due on the first of the month. But your best friend and your worst enemy are equally welcome too. In this home, strangers become friends, and hosts one day are visiting guests the next. We are a pilgrim people, a people of journey, looking for home, but not there yet. We are gifted with the firm and unwavering promise that a home is still to come. We are never forgotten. We are not cast out. Reconciliation is coming. The journey is long, but we do not walk it alone. Although we are prone to wander, let's seal our hearts and steady our eyes on the horizon of what truly matters. I believe we'll make it if we go together and go with God. Amen.